On this Focus Asia special, a look back at the Vietnam War 40 years after it began with a clash between naval forces in the Gulf of Tonkin. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Karen Coe. Tonight, a look back into the archive of stories we've brought you since Focus Asia went on the air in January 2000. And a special program about the Vietnam War, a war with many parallels to today's conflict in Iraq. The weapons of mass destruction which Washington used to justify going to war in Iraq have turned out to be non-existent. And way back in August 1964, reported North Vietnamese attacks on American ships used to justify escalation of that conflict also turned out to be untrue. We'll look back tonight at the war from three perspectives: the winning North Vietnamese side, the losing South Vietnamese side, but first, that of a young, well now slightly older, American journalist who was there at the end of the war in 1975. Focus Asia's executive producer, Jim Laurie.
It ended with a bang, North Vietnamese tanks crashing through the gates of South Vietnam's presidential palace. All of Saigon that day seemed to erupt in gunfire. The gunfire of celebration. A 30-year war involving first the French and then the Americans was over. For many Vietnamese, it was the defining moment of their lives.
First of all, I was very happy because our country was liberated. And I myself really survived during this cruel, barbarous war.
My family were business owners and we were very scared of what the communists might do to us. And back then, I couldn't imagine that in just a few years I would become a refugee and my life would change forever.
To the young reporters here, like the Far Eastern Economic Review's Nayan Chanda, the end, when it came with unexpected suddenness.
So the end was near, but I didn't realize it was so near because suddenly I hear a sound, enormous sound coming to the open door. I look at the door and see in the frame of the door a tank crossing the frame of the door, and at the back of the tank flying a red and gold flag. So I said, wow.
South Vietnam had collapsed in only 55 days after a massive offensive. In a bunker 30 kilometers north of Saigon, Commanding General Van Tien Dung and the top brass of the North Vietnamese Army were about to have a party.
When we got the news that the tanks had entered Saigon, a great cheer went up from the bunker. We were all crying with joy and hugging each other. And then we phoned Hanoi to announce our great spring victory.
In Saigon, I watched as the tanks moved through the city. Less than 4 hours earlier, I had watched the last American helicopter leave the roof of the American embassy. Frightened Vietnamese who could not get out beseeched me for help I could not provide.
We don't want to stay here in a way. I understand. The Americans are gone.
Yes, I know that, but I must come in case, just in case.
But there's no way because all the helicopters are gone.
Can you help us?
There is no way I can help because we are staying here. We are staying in Saigon.
In a frenzy of panic, some 33,000 Vietnamese had fled with the American embassy, all within 24 hours. Some desperately forcing their way into the embassy grounds. Some of the South Vietnamese army flew their helicopters to the U.S. fleet off the coast, ditching their aircraft in the sea. Once the Americans were gone, Vietnamese took out their anger in an orgy of destruction. Only a few reporters remained behind as witnesses.
The U.S. Embassy behind me has been completely looted. The South Vietnamese obviously are angry at the American withdrawal. Many of them have said that they were left out in the evacuation. They were unable to make the helicopters. Many of them were American employees. They have had to stay, and they will now have to stay and cope with communism in South Vietnam.
But many, of course, could not cope. In the next 7 years, between 1975 and 1982, more than 2 million people fled Vietnam, the largest permanent displacement of refugees since World War II. Thousands of people had homes, businesses confiscated. Tens of thousands more went to re-education camps, some for up to 15 years or until they died. And still more were sent to so-called new economic zones, forced to live in the most basic conditions. For more than 10 years, people continued to flee, up to 20,000 a month, the boat people. 1 in 3 boats attacked by pirates, murders, rapes, untold thousands never made it.
Vietnam, or the communists, the socialists, won the war and they've lost the peace, and I think they know it. They made a number of mistakes. They encountered hardships that they didn't expect.
They also encountered more war. Vietnamese troops invaded Cambodia, overthrew the hated dictator Pol Pot, and stayed on there for 10 years. And China, a former ally, invaded Vietnam.
History will eventually bring them before the bar of justice.
China said it was going to teach Vietnam a lesson for its invasion of Cambodia.
I think Chinese in the end got punished because Chinese took heavy casualty, up to 50,000 casualty Chinese took.
Still, the Vietnamese and their economy suffered.
A huge proportion of the Vietnamese adult male population wound up either on the border with China or fighting against the Chinese-sponsored Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And this was then male labor force that was not available for more productive activity.
It was not until 1988 that Vietnam finally put the war behind it. Hanoi's leaders launched Doi Moi, a policy of economic reform. Finally, Vietnam began to grow, to prosper. With privatization, growth surged to 8% a year. Foreign investment and overseas Vietnamese were attracted back. As one writer put it, in Vietnam, the present is complex, the past uncertain, but the future is glorious.
Feel that they have responsibility to give the hand to stop the war.
Our sacrifice was great because the American enemy was extremely cruel.
Well, we've been living on this land for nearly 4,000 years, and every generation we have to fight off some sort of, foreign aggression so that we can have our own say.
Ngo Thi Tuyen is your unconventional war veteran. Tuyen, like hundreds of thousands of other women, helped in the communist Viet Cong's fight for liberation. They kept the food and ammunition supply open for their menfolk in the battlefields. They defended villages, strategic military locations, and the treacherous Ho Chi Minh Trail.
I just thought that if the American enemy comes to destroy Vietnam, then people, especially the young people of my generation then, must hold a gun and fight.
She lives in Thanh Hoa province, several hours away from Hanoi. This is where more than 3 decades ago, tens of thousands of youths answered Uncle Ho Chi Minh's call to arms. Tuyen was 19 years old when she volunteered to become a militia woman. But then again, Tuyen says many had no choice. In the early morning hours on April 4th, 1965, amid heavy American bombardment, Tuyen managed to carry 2 munitions boxes to artillery positions defending the Hang Rong Bridge, also known as Dragon Jaw Bridge. The munitions were 98 kilograms, twice her own body weight. Till this day, it's an unbelievable feat that draws awe and even skepticism.
I was only 42 kilos, then there were some in the Western media who didn't believe I could carry 98 kilos worth of munitions in the boxes, so someone asked me to carry 105 kilos worth of rice and yams to prove it, so I did. Only then did they believe me.
In 1965, the North Vietnamese government awarded her 2 first-class medals and a Ho Chi Minh Badge of Honor for her bravery under fire. 2 years later, she was given the title of the Hero of the People's Armed Forces.
We had to sacrifice ourselves. Some lived and some died. I have to try and forget the past to overcome the wounds of war.
The 55-year-old admits that's been difficult. The war has left Tuyen in poor health, while her husband says his time as a North Vietnamese soldier serving near the DMZ left him under constant exposure to the toxic defoliant Agent Orange. Both decided early on they would not have children, fearing the risks of having a deformed child would be too great. It seems they make up a group of veterans who have become Vietnam's unknown casualties of war. This is no ordinary visit for Vietnam Airlines chief pilot Nguyen Tan Trung. It's a family outing to the Reunification Palace in Ho Chi Minh City. The last time the 52-year-old was here, it was called the Presidential Palace, and his view of the building was not from the ground, but high above, from the seat of a fighter plane.
The bomb in Independence Palace. The reason I told you that the war hasn't happened in Vietnam, it's a very long time. That's very long time, more than 20 years. And myself is a Vietnamese, the youth of Vietnamese. I feel that I have responsibility to give the hand to stop the war.
On April 8, 1975, Trung's life and the fate of South Vietnam changed forever. At the controls of his American F-5 fighter jet, he defected from South Vietnam. He left his mark by dropping 2 bombs onto the roof of the presidential palace, an act which for most signaled the imminent demise of South Vietnam.
When I was 14 years old, my father was shot dead by the South Vietnamese soldier. And at that time I thought, what happened to my life? And at that age changed to my life that I asked for President Ngo Dinh Diem. Jim had responsible for the responsibility for the death of my father.
In May of 1969, Trung became a member of the Communist Viet Cong, just 1 day before he joined the South Vietnamese Air Force.
I planned that bombing for 12 years, from 1963 to 1975.
After his bombing mission, Trung flew away from Saigon and into a hero's welcome.
I never thought I'd do that action for the future and become a hero. But I told you, I just do what I have to do, what the youth of that time had to do to end the war.
Win Ngoc Hong is a professor of foreign studies at Hanoi University, and his knowledge of the war isn't academic. The mild-mannered teacher is a war veteran who saw combat in the DMZ.
Well, in the early years, it was very scary. But I stayed for 6 years fighting, and you got used to it.
Was it worth it?
Well, the real question is, did you have a choice?
Little did he know that Liberation Day would mark the beginning of what would be a lifelong search. When you first heard your brother was missing in action, how did you feel?
Oh, I was very sad, very, very sad. He was very close to me, and we shared so many, happy days together when we were at school.
Hong's little brother, Win Ngoc Hong, was 18 years old when he was sent to the battlefield in 1970. He never returned. Hong became one of 300,000 Vietnamese soldiers missing in action.
After the war, I went to every friend of him who served in the same division, and we got the maps, we got everything. We tried every different ways, and the local governments of the university had helped in so many different ways, but we simply couldn't find him.
Hong's family traveled to the Central Highlands and visited countless military cemeteries in search of Hong's remains. They had no success, that is, until they met a psychic late last year.
The psychic had drawn a map and identified the location of the grave. So we went straight to the cemetery.
Hong's family brought Hong's remains back home last December. It was an emotional end to a 30-year search. Today, Hong pays respects to his long-lost brother and other MIAs who finally come home.
These people are resting here in peace, nearer to the home. We feel soothing when we have the remains of, the family back home. When you die, the spirit still lives on. That's him.
It seems laying to rest the ghosts of war has proven difficult, especially for the 300,000 families of those missing in action, and the veterans who are still trying to heal war wounds of their own.
Sometimes Vietnam comes back to me in a dream as a simple sound. I am a small boy of 8 or 9. I lay awake listening to the murmurs of my own heart. Ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. And suddenly, the sounds are those of exploding B-52 bombs which echoed from a distant battlefield. I am in Hue, where my father was a South Vietnamese military commander near the end of the war. The sounds of the B-52 were for me the sound of security, of the Americans helping to protect us. Yet, for the North Vietnamese, they were the sounds that nightmares were made of.
At the time I was very small, so I
I go with my mother, and the plane came, and we rushed into the shelter. And when we was the shelter, we feel very frightened, of course, because plane is something very, very powerful, yeah. And the bombing is very dangerous for every people.
But our family belonged to the South, and though I was 11 when the war ended, I was already profoundly marked by war. In 1972, my father was called in to turn the tide against North Vietnamese troops who had invaded Quang Tri province across the DMZ, or demilitarized zone dividing North and South.
The South Vietnamese are locked in a head-on clash for supremacy over the area just south of the DMZ. The fate of South Vietnam's northern province seems to rest on the shoulders of soldiers like these, and it also seemed to be the hopes of the American policy of Vietnamization.
With the help of American bombing under my father's command, we beat back the North Vietnamese then. My father took us to see the aftermath of those terrible battles. 27 years later, I came back to scenes of my childhood memories.
This is the closest landing strip to the DMZ in Quang Tri, and as you can see, it's all bombed out. My father used to fly here from Hue, landing his helicopter, and once in a while he would take me and my brother.
Our family flew out of Vietnam 2 days before Saigon's collapse. In San Jose, California, I recently asked my father about the old battlefields.
Why did you take me and my older brother and sister out there?
Because I want you to face the suffering of the people, and also I want you to recognize the sacrifice of the young Vietnamese soldiers who died for the cause of freedom and democracy.
To us as kids all those years ago, the world was so simple then. There was a civil war, and we belonged to the South. This is the land we were fighting over. This is the land my father was sworn to protect.
But as I grew up, I was to find out it was not sacrifice, nor heroics, but rather betrayal that was the only consistent theme of the Vietnam story. Though they had sacrificed 58,000 men in the war, my father reminded me the Americans withdrew military aid to us in 1974.
As a result of that, we ran out of ammunition. We have no more ammunition. We don't have spare parts for our aircraft. We don't have fuel for our trucks. So we have no air support. So that's why we could not, beat back the last NVA offensive in 1975.
And so, instead of fighting, many South Vietnamese fled, shedding uniforms to avoid surrender. The ultimate betrayal, I think, is the one against memory. 25 years on, Vietnam is at peace and flourishing. But on a plane to Saigon this month, a businessman old enough to remember the war, but young enough to remake himself, had this advice for me.
Vietnam is very livable now, the man said. But to live here, you must pretend amnesia. Remember too much, and it will only bring sadness. Oh, and it gets in the way of making money.
I am happy that Vietnam is thriving at last. But if the price to live here is amnesia, then for me at least, it's a price too high to pay. After all, it's difficult to belong to a nation that refuses to acknowledge its history. The cemeteries of northern soldiers are pristine and well kept. But outside Saigon, there is a graveyard of forgotten soldiers, 60,000 or so. This burial place of the defeated army receives no honors, no respect. I also want someone to remember that here in Hue, the communists killed thousands of unarmed Vietnamese during the Tet Offensive of 1968. As I journey from Hue to Quang Tri once more, it occurs to me that there will always be two Vietnams. The one here, roaring with life as it yearns to integrate into the global economy. And the other, my Vietnam, one that exists nowhere but in memories. Here then, to memory, day turned into night and my trip from Hue to Quang Tri as a child in my father's helicopter after the battles of 1972. The cool, fresh air, the chopping sounds of the helicopter, and a beautiful moon rising in a darkening sky. Looking down, I saw the moon's reflection racing with us from Lotus Pond to flooded rice field. The rice had ripened, and its fragrance reached my nostrils, along with the smell of the dead killed in battle. It was then I knew no one was left to harvest the rice that season.
And that's all from this Focus Asia special. We'll leave you now with some images and sounds of Vietnam during the war and today. From me, Karen Ko, thanks for watching and goodbye.